This is Major Christina Rusnock, and today we're going to go over Chapter 3 in Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. This chapter is titled Billboard Design 101. As you'll recall from the previous lesson, users don't read web pages, they scan them. So what we're going to go today is how to design for scanning as opposed to designing for reading. To make sure that users see and understand what they need to know, designers should do 6 things. They should take advantage of conventions. They should create effective visual hierarchies. They should break pages into clearly defined areas. They should make it obvious what's clickable. They should eliminate distractions. And finally, they should format content to support scanning. We're going to go over each of these 6 in more detail in this lesson. All right, the first one is to take advantage of conventions. And conventions are widely used, standardized design patterns. You see these examples not just on the web, but in all aspects of life. So, for example, stop signs. Even if you can't read them, you know what they are because they use the same color, shape, size, height, and location wherever you find them. Similarly, controls in cars. If you think about the location of the gas pedal versus the brake pedal, that is something that has been standardized throughout. And the great thing about these conventions is you don't have to relearn them for every single vehicle or for every single instance, right? You learn the rule once and it applies universally. And that's what we want to take advantage with our web design. Right, so I've got some examples here. Well, it's a video of little bubs. Sorry, there's a video icon that you'll see, right, which is this play button, right? Pretty much any video will have that play button that shows you that this is a video, and you know that you can click on it to begin playing. You'll often see the search icon in a text block, right, and this reveals to you not only that you can type in text in these blocks, but that if you then push that search button or you push enter, you then know that it will actually search that site for the results of what you've entered. Some more web conventions, right? We've got links. Links are commonly displayed in blue text, no matter where you go. That's very common. And of course, if you click on a link, it's very common for previously used links to change from that bright blue to a purplish blue color. And then of course we've got our familiar social media icons, right? And when you see these, you know that you can click on those to take whatever content you're currently looking at and share it via those social media icons. So we've got all of these web conventions, but designers are often very tempted to violate these conventions. And the reason why is they're designers. Many of them have gone to design school and they want to be creative. They don't want to be seen as following the standard or following the norm. They want to prove their own value by doing something that is original. And I'm going to urge you as designers, and when you work with teams of designers, to help try to control them and resist that urge to violate conventions. If you decide that you're not going to use a convention, you need to have a very good reason. And there's 2 different reasons that you can not use a convention. The first is that what you're trying to do is so clear and so self-explanatory that there's no learning curve. Then it's fine. Or what you're doing adds so much value that it's worth the small learning curve. Then it's okay to violate the convention. Now, we're not trying to quash creativity itself, right? So a designer can still be creative. They can still create items that are aesthetically pleasing, but we want to make sure that when they do that, the end product is still usable, right? So you can design an aesthetically pleasing website while still using standard web conventions. Occasionally, you'll find that things can actually be made clearer if you make them slightly inconsistent, right? So if there's a case where violating a convention or making an item on your site inconsistent with the rest of the items on the site would actually make it more clear to the user what that particular item is to do, then that's okay. Our rule here is clarity trumps consistency, because consistency is not an end in itself, but rather it's a means to the end of usability, clarity, ease of use, right? So if you find that consistency is going to conflict with clarity, then please go with clarity. All right, so that first principle for helping people that are trying to not read but scan, right, for designing billboards, is to use conventions. The reason why that aids scanning is because users already know what they mean, and they recognize those visual images very clearly. That the web conventions tend to pop for the user. So if you think back to the previous lesson where I showed you what the user does and does not see on the page, when a user goes to a page, the things that get fuzzy are those items that are not readily familiar to them, and the areas that really pop are those conventions. The second principle is to create effective visual hierarchies. Now, a visual hierarchy is the visual cue that portrays the relationship between the various items that are on the page. Right? And so visual hierarchies actually have three characteristics. The first characteristic is the more important something is, the more prominent it is. So we've got this example here where this yellow block is my web page. And we can see that the item that is the most bold and the highest on the page and the largest in size, that's the one that's most important. And then as I decrease the boldness, the font size, and the location on the page, it gets less and less important. The second principle in a visual hierarchy is that things that are related logically should be related visually. Right? So relating items visually means grouping them together. Right? So these items are related logically because they might be the navigation in a site that perhaps sells books, music, movies, and games. And not only would you cluster those like items together, for example, navigation, but you would also want to relate them visually by creating some kind of separation if possible, right? So by creating a color barrier and a line barrier, creating this window, right? We've visually separated the content that's over here from any content that might be in here. And finally, things are nested visually to show what is part of what, right? So ignore me, said color on these, but you can see here that I've got this title computer books, and these two items are visually nested inside this bigger block. So we know that both of these items belong to computer books. If I were to then have another one of these blue boxes down below and it was titled recipe books, then you would know that the items that are nested within it belong to that title, right? And then we can see here that within this computer books, we've got two other visually nested items, and we know that all of the content in this particular block belongs to this one particular computer book, right? So we might have a description and a picture, maybe even a price. Same with this other one, that all of this information belongs to this one, right? So we can use nesting to show what's part of what. Now, these visual hierarchies are actually a very old concept, and it applies to all text, not just to web-based text, right? So if we look here at an example newspaper, you'll see that we use that first principle of the more important something is, the more prominent it is. So higher on the page, bolder font, larger fonts, and we know that even though these two items are on the same area, this is really the more important thing that we want to read. Of these two articles, this one appears to be more important because of the larger font. So we're seeing that visual hierarchy, and like I said, this applies to all text. It applies to newspapers, books, magazines, PowerPoint slides, the web, And the reason why visual hierarchies are so valuable is they provide useful information, right? It tells us that this story is more important than this story. By doing the nesting, we see that this picture goes with this title. We see that this picture goes with this story and title, right? So we have these nesting options that show us what goes with what. And interpreting it is very natural. The user does not have to think in order to interpret a visual hierarchy. In fact, it's so natural we don't even realize that we're doing it. We're not taught how to interpret visual hierarchies, but rather it's intuitive. And we don't realize we're doing it unless we can't, right? So if somebody creates a page that does not follow visual hierarchy rules, but rather violates them, that's when we begin to realize that there's a problem. And that's when we begin to realize that we do interpret visual hierarchies and something is amiss. So a good visual hierarchy organizes and prioritizes the content. And this is to your advantage when you're doing web design, because you should have information that you want organized, and you should also have priorities on which information is most important that you really want to make sure the user sees. And it enables the user to grasp the most salient information almost instantly. Right, so if we go back to this page, very quickly we find the House has passed the trade bill and the GOP runners are facing off a national televised debate. Very instantly we can pull that information out without having to dig all over the page in order to determine what's going on. Right? A poor visual hierarchy makes everything look equally important. You can't tell what you need to pull out from the page because everything seems to want to jump out of the page unless nothing does. It also slows the user's progress, right? They can't find those pieces of salient information, so they have to dig around and all over the place to try to find them. And of course, it consumes the user's cognitive resources because they're having to do all of that interpretation that really you should have done for them. You should have done the organization and the prioritization. And by not having a visual hierarchy, it's now their job. All right, so the third principle for effective billboard design is breaking up pages into clearly defined areas. Right? A well-designed web page allows users to play a variation of that old TV show game, $25,000 Pyramid. Right? So they should be looking around the site and they should say, this area over here, this is things I can do on the site. And these are links to today's top stories. And this is products the company sells. And this is navigation to the rest of the site. Right? When they're looking around, they should be able to say those category names, even if they're not labeled that way, because of the way they're grouped together, because of the way the pages are broken up into clearly defined area. They can take the items on that list and they can say, this is the category it falls into. And the nice thing about clearly defined areas is it allows users to quickly decide where they need to focus, because they probably are only interested in one of those categories depending on their goal or mission. And so if they can figure out what all the categories are, then they can quickly decide, okay, this is the category I want. I want links to today's top stories. And then they know that they can safely ignore the rest of the site because all of the links to today's top stories are going to be right there in that section that they're looking at. The fourth principle is to make it obvious what's clickable. So when we look at a page, the visual cues should signal to us whether or not an item is clickable, or if you're using a mobile device, tappable. Right? And there's a couple of different things that we can do. We can use a shape, so the shape of a button, the shape of a tab, the location. So if we have a clearly defined menu bar, we'll know that, okay, if this item's in the menu bar, it must be a menu item and thus clickable. Formatting, especially with links, right? So color, underlining, these are cues that allow us to know what is and is not clickable. what you want to make sure that you do is you don't make the mistake of using those same cues, for example, the color, for things that are and are not clickable, right? So if you have a blue color for your links, then don't use that same blue color for your non-clickable headings, right? You want to really make sure that when you've picked a visual cue to signal something, then whenever you use that signal, it really is a signal and not noise. So give you some examples of things that are obviously clickable. All right, this is TripAdvisor. You can see down here in the center, we've got these buttons, and we know they're buttons because of the card-like shapes that they've got on them. We've got these blue text here, which are names of restaurants, and those are blue because they're clickable. We've also got the number of reviews, and it turns out that item is also clickable as well. Right? Search buttons are clickable, and then we've got some advertising buttons down here. They've also followed the example of grouping like items together, right? My search results are all down here, my categories are all up here. These advertisements that are outside of the scope of the site are all grouped together instead of being scattered all over the page, right? So all these items come together in a way that's really nice. The headings down here, up here, are clickable, and we even know based on the arrows which ones when I click on it is going to give me a list of menus, and which one when I click on it is going to actually just take me to a new location of the site because it doesn't have a list of menu items under it. Alright, so let's look at some not so obvious. AMS, probably seen this one already. It's not clear what's clickable. I think I did go through this before, right? So we've got these items here. They're obviously clickable. However, we have a blue item that's underlined down here, not clickable. And then we've got these this menu items here, which they don't look like buttons because they're not individually defined. They don't have the little down arrow mark. They're not located at the top. Maybe if this banner here was actually located at the very top of the screen or along the left-hand side in a location, that would make it obvious that it was navigation. But there are no cues at all to tell us that these particular three items are clickable. All right. Our fifth item for helping to facilitate scanning is to eliminate distractions. Right? So we've got a lot of visual noise, a lot of things going on the page. It will make that page very difficult to grasp. Right? And there are three types of visual noise. There's shouting, disorganization, and clutter. Right? So shouting is when it looks like everything is really highly emphasized. Right? So instead of just having a block of everything size 12 point font Times New Roman, everything is 24 font and bright red color with exclamation points. And, right? If everything is emphasized, then of course nothing becomes emphasized. Disorganization, of course, if items are all over the page, especially the items that you're trying to get the user's attention with, that can make it very hard and very distracting. Very hard for them to find what they're doing, and very distracting. And then, of course, clutter, right? So if you just have a lot of content, that can be problematic, and it probably means that you need to break it up into several pages. You don't necessarily need to fit everything onto the home page. It's okay to have a link to a section where I can then go and see that content. Right, so we're going to look at some examples. Again, so shouting and disorganization, this one definitely has both of those. We've got items in red, so those feel like they're probably supposed to be important, but we only have one item in green, so that one feels important. And then we've got a number of items like this one and this one and this one that are in all caps, clearly shouting. This item here, even though it's not red or green, it's got 3 asterisks on either side and it's in all caps, so this one's important. If you look down here, it's very hard to tell what item on this page is not important. It feels like everything. They wanted you to review everything, and instead it just makes you harder to view anything. Right? There's a little bit of disorganization issues too, because we've got 2 sets of navigation, which is not very helpful. We've got announcements up here, and we've got some announcements up here, down here. So we're not really keeping all of our like content together. It's not very clear. In fact, this may or may not, some of these items really probably don't need to be navigation. I don't know that requesting tech support and FAQ and the AFPC homepage, those items there really need to be navigational items. They could have probably been relegated to a much less prominent position. All right, for clutter, going back to my favorite board game geek, lots of things going on. One of the things that really clutters this is that it's got announcements, sponsor content, it's got all kinds of forums with threads going on, and they put all this content right on the homepage open so that you see the top 7 items, 5 to 7 items for each one. That's probably highly unnecessary. They could have had just a place to go. They could have had announcements, although really here you're not seeing the information that's announced, you're just seeing the name, right? So they could have had just an announcements, just a sponsored contest, right? And you could have then had to click on this to go to that section, and that would really clean this site up a lot if they took a lot of this content and actually made it a level deeper. They've also got a lot of different color coding going on, which helps to kind of create visual clutter, because there are so many colors that you see that nothing really pops that much. There's a lot of blue, so that kind of pops. There's these oranges, there's these reds, there's some yellow. Right? All of these different items make it more difficult for you to find the item that's most important. And it's almost kind of clear that nothing's really important on this site, or more important than anything else. And finally, you want to format the text itself to support scanning. Right? Since we know our users want to scan, let them scan. Right? And the way you support scanning is you use plenty of headings, you keep your paragraphs short, you use bulleted lists, and you highlight key terms. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like using PowerPoint. If you have text, you may actually go in and break up that text in a way that it wouldn't naturally have been if you had put it in a document. Right? You can actually create additional headings that weren't in the original document. Take every paragraph and give that paragraph a heading. Take really long paragraphs and break them up into shorter paragraphs. Right? So if you're returning an assignment to an English teacher, they may complain if you only have a 2-sentence paragraph. Your web user is not going to complain if you have a paragraph that's only 2 sentences long. Right? They'll probably thank you. So I'm going to give you an example here. I grabbed both of these from 2 websites. This is an article from The Economist, and then this was a top 10 tips on how to improve your sleeping. Right? And as you can see here, they could have written. This is very difficult to scan. Right? There's nothing that pops out. It's not very clear. Here, it's very easy to scan. You can really quickly pick up what those 4 tips are. And if you're like, well, what do they mean by a restful sleeping environment? Then you can come in here and say, okay, bedroom, quiet, dark, not too hot or cold, lighting controlled, right? And say, okay, so those are the kinds of things that I can do in my environment. Right? And I didn't really read it because I, like many users, wouldn't actually take the time to read it. I would just scan. Right? And so short paragraphs are much easier to find those keywords. Those headings make it really great to know whether or not I even need to look into that paragraph for the keywords. I can pick out the pieces of information I need to know. And actually, when web readers scan, especially when they're on a mission, right, they actually can take more content away when they scan. They can get through content faster. They can get through a larger quantity of content. And because they weren't distracted by irrelevant details or irrelevant side items, they're able to actually comprehend the information that they were looking to comprehend. All right. So, in summary, to make sure users see and understand what they need to know, that is to really design those effective billboards, designers should take advantage of conventions, create effective visual hierarchies, break pages up into clearly defined areas, make it obvious what's clickable, eliminate distractions, and format content to support scanning. Right? And while these principles are presented in the context of web design, keep in mind that most of these are highly applicable to all areas of human-computer interaction. At a minimum, they're definitely applicable to all areas of text-related interaction. The visual hierarchies, the defined areas, the supporting scanning. But whatever project or product you're working on, when you go back into the acquisition world, think about these principles. There's no reason to violate conventions or to eliminate your visual hierarchies. That just adds confusion and increases the chance that errors will occur or that important information will be missed.